Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on chumbacasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at chumbacasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's chumbacasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Welcome to ParaTruth.
What's going on, ParaTruthers? Welcome to another episode of ParaTruth Reborn. My name is Justin, and today we're playing a replay of our episode from ParaTruth Radio entitled Evil Archaeology. This is a pre-recorded show on 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. We're going to go to the show, and we hope you enjoy.
Today we have a very special guest. Her name is Dr. Heather Lynn. She is a historian, a renegade archaeologist, and defender of classical education, a professor of humanities by day and ardent truth seeker by night. Heather is on a mission to uncover and share the lost wisdom of antiquity, challenging the accepted narrative found in our history books. Author of multiple books and articles on fringe topics ranging from history to philosophy, Heather's research includes hidden history, ancient mysteries, mythology, the occult, symbolism, paleocontact, and consciousness.
And without further ado, we're going to go to the line with Dr. Heather Lynn.
Dr. Heather Lynn, welcome to ParaTruth Radio. How are you this evening?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. We've been excited to talk to you. So I think
Likewise.
right off the bat, I really just want to get an idea here of what it was that really had you decide on Evil Archaeology for a book. And, what was it that took you on this journey and made you think, oh, this is going to be a great book for people? And really, what kind of reader is this book geared toward?
Well, I guess my inspiration, I would like to say that it was something, a little deeper than what it actually was. But my inspiration was the movie The Exorcist. In the beginning scene from the book and movie, there's a scene from an archaeological excavation in Iraq. And at the site, a priest archaeologist feels this strong wind blowing, and it's foreshadowing the arrival of the demon Pazuzu of Mesopotamia. And the demon statue featured on the cover of the book is actually the Pazuzu, which is the demon that possessed the character in the movie. And, it's I was brought up Catholic, and I was not really supposed to be watching that movie at any point in time. And, I did see it, and it was there in my reference. And, life goes on, and I hadn't seen it for a while. And as an adult, I saw it, and I picked up on that beginning sequence that I hadn't connected before. And, because of my line of work, I found it a little interesting, and I started to then ponder the relationship between demons of ancient Mesopotamia and the modern era. And I wondered if demons of the ancient world could still be with us today. It was sort of a passing thought. But it wasn't long after seeing the movie then that I read a news story about a man in North Carolina who changed his name to Pazuzu so that he could honor that particular demon. And he went on, he was actually discussed because he was a murderer, and he cannibalized his neighbors, and he was involved in these horrific crimes that he believed he was taking part in as a way to worship and all this these Mesopotamian demons and this sort of thing. And I thought, well, that's just weird and interesting, and it was interesting timing, of course, and so it was fresh on my mind. And I started thinking about that, and I thought, clearly this individual is responsible for his own actions, but he claimed to be inspired by these demons to do these things. And I considered the Latin for inspiration, the inspirare meaning to breathe or blow into, and how it was originally used to describe when a supernatural being imparted an idea onto someone. And so I thought about this question of possession, and I wondered, well, what is possession but an evil spiritual entity inhabiting a willing person and encouraging them to do evil things? And so I started toying with the idea, well, what is this fine line between something like inspiration and something that would be possession? And I wondered about how do we view these sorts of activities now, and how did the ancients view this? Because there have always been, people who've done these horrific things and crimes and the idea of evil. And I just started wondering about that. So I don't know that I had a particular demographic in mind when I wrote the book. I just, most of the time, what I do when I write is just follow my own questions and ponderings and interests. And hopefully, what I do is I present something that other people may find as interesting as I do. I work on it as a journey of exploration, and I try in my work to present it as such. So I don't usually have a either an agenda or a point that I want to get across. I just I look at things with the questions, and then I also know where my expertise lie and where they don't. So with that said, I enlisted the help of or the input in some ways of people that might be better well versed in things like exorcisms. So, for instance, I interviewed Bill Dean, an exorcist, on his views on this sort of thing, and so I looked at it as more of an exploration into the origin of evil and the connection between how that was shaped in the past and evolved, and how it may be at play today.
Okay.
All right. Well, here's a question for you. A lot of serial killers have used symbols, for example, um, not necessarily for power per se, but for the symbolism itself, like the uh, pentagram, Charlie Manson, um, the Night Stalker, several others have used the symbolism. Zodiac used symbols as well. A lot of times that we talk about demonic possession here on ParaTruth, but we also talk about how maybe us as humans giving these particular things power over spiritual entities actually doing these things can have the same effect. What are your thoughts on that?
I think so. I think that is, probably one of the things that I explored in the book, in the research, was this idea between the tangible, actual reality of something like a demon versus what we put onto things. So, such as like amulet or symbols. I tried to use an approach, sometimes referred to as cognitive archaeology, so that I could look at the meanings, concept, characteristics, and symbols and description of things to not just look at assigning blame or, but trying to have a more complex or nuanced look at these matters, but also at the same time, not ruling out the question of, the spiritual components. Could there
Mm.
actually be something more to this? And is it something that when we're looking at symbols and as the result, language, the concept of linguistics, are we just limiting ourselves by the language we're using? Or is it actually enhancing, or is it completely complicating matters? And so in some ways, it's like you could look at these issues and think, well, we're using these different terms to describe this maybe demon or, an entity or, while at the same time, um, the ancients might have been using that particular term to describe an illness. And so it may sound like splitting hairs, but in some ways it would seem like, um, when you take Occam's razor and you just maybe look a little more closely and take some of that symbolism out, or, some of the maybe ornamental value of it, it becomes a little more like we're all talking about the same thing. And and when I say all, I mean through different cultures, even religions, different time periods, that we are sharing this experience, and whatever it may be, whether it's the way someone's behaving differently or horrific acts that we can't understand that defy our comfort level of what we may feel is the natural order, however you want to frame it. There's something there that across languages and experiences and belief sets, we just know. And we, as people, developed ways to describe these things, and we can call them demons, evil entities. Some called them just angels in general, or spirits, or, there's so many different ways to look at it. Jinn, or even if they're not anthropomorphized, they could just be a symbol of an animal, or as you said, a pentagram, or something actually tangible. Either way, uh, I think that there is a very simple, not easy, but simple thread that can be kind of seen holding everything together. I think that we're all on the same page about something, and the language is what it is that maybe we need to, look more deeply into. And so that's kind of what I found with symbols, because symbols are, a form of language as well. How much power do we give those symbols? And that's another question to consider is, words have a lot of meaning, as do, amulets or these sorts of things. Even if it's just how we feel about them, those feelings can turn into action that have very real physical consequences. So that leaves us with a lot of different questions and things. So, people can talk all day about how many angels can fit on the, tip of a needle or what have you. But these are very real questions that have practical, consequences. That, oh, is something evil? What is evil? Does this match my religion or morality, et cetera, et cetera? At the end of the day, while those are very important theological discussions, we know evil when we see it. And, we have to sort of have these symbols, have these terms so that we can function in a society as well. And that's what I believe has happened since the beginning is if you look at the ancient Mesopotamian, demonology, a lot of it is primitive medicine. And so while they had all of these different names for demons, they had a lot of symptoms for the possessions, and they were really diseases. But at the same time, they sort of anthropomorphize the disease. And for example, if you had cancer, you need to have these symptoms. And instead of calling it cancer, they might have named it after Lamastro, one of the demons. So yes, they anthropomorphized it, but what is that? There's something there. And I think, it's served a practical purpose because it's gotten us so far in development to where we are today that they actually laid the groundwork for modern medicine. And so, symbols are very important, and whether or not they can by themselves have some sort of independent, imbued power, it's hard to really say. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. But I will say that the what people put onto them, the meaning that they put onto that, have very real and tangible consequences, and so it's very important to even consider such things.
So with that said, like considering we talk a lot about how there are various ways that people can accidentally open doors to the spiritual realm. And so with your conversations with like the exorcists and the interviews, did you find anything, maybe they said anything regarding whether or not superstition really plays into many of the demonic possessions that they actually take call to? Or is it, I mean,
Mhm. Well, not necessarily. Yeah, and that's something interesting because the idea of superstition, um, you know, that's a really interesting concept in and of itself because it's easy to dismiss something as just superstition. But at the same time, where did we come up with these ideas? It's almost like a maybe genetic memory or some sort of folk knowledge that tells us, let's put on the brakes before we start doing these things. And so, but in terms of, my discussions with various exorcists, um, the idea of dabbling, that's a very popular idea. Nobody that I spoke to when researching this book at all said that dabbling would be a good idea. And that includes psychologists. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of a religious point of view, even versus just maybe a more secular and psychological point of view, something with regard to superstition or something like that. Either way, if you are concerned about letting some sort of negativity in, that idea of dabbling is just really not recommended, at least not what I found. That it's something that does open doorways. And if it doesn't actually, from the perspective of exorcists that I spoke to, they agree that it can open spiritual or metaphysical doorways. By contrast, the psychologists that I spoke to both said that it can open doorways on a subconscious level, which to me, is very closely aligned with that metaphysical or spiritual component. So it just may be, again, another idea, the linguistic difference, but kind of, but at least coming to the same conclusion that for whichever reason, however you may have developed the methodology to reach that conclusion, it's probably not a good idea to dabble because it can open doors. And those doors are perhaps, subjective, however somebody wants to describe that, whether, again, they're spiritual doors or if it's just subconscious doors. Some would argue those are one and the same. And that would just be that question of splitting the mind, the idea of mind, the mind body. And that maybe that's something we shouldn't do because they're connected in a holistic way, that subconscious and that consciousness, the spirituality component of it, they're actually more closely related. That's kind of where I would tend to fall. The idea that, there's the spiritual, and then there's also something that's more psychological, and that those things are actually not in conflict. And as much as it may seem like they are to somebody with a particular bias or the other, I see a lot of ways that they overlap, at least for the practical outcome. And so at the end of the day, if you're somebody's concerned about bringing that negativity to them, whether they think it's in the form of a anthropomorphized entity, or if it's just something that maybe it is superstitious and they don't want that to enter their psyche, um, however they reach that, I think it's probably helpful to at least not open those doors.
All right. Well, actually, as you were talking, I kind of had a question too. It was, you had mentioned earlier, and I read in the book about how there were a lot of different cultures that would use different things to let out the evil spirits, even though really they were kind of truly treating diseases as well. How often than not were there deaths or even brain damage from these particular evil spirit letting out type practices?
Well, I think I don't know if I actually reference a particular number because, as you said, that is something cross-culturally you'll find
Right.
because of the different ways that people perform exorcism. So there would be actually quite a few if you look at, especially in foreign countries, you'll see a lot of people doing something with maybe folk medicine or things that maybe wouldn't be, um, you know, something we would consider safe, maybe in a more developed country. However, it's 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 not even safe to consider it, just because it's a developed nation, something that would be modern or contemporary that, "Oh, well, it'll happen without a flaw," or, because it's we've actually seen in relatively recent years, people in the United States, dying from these activities. And so, for instance, in '97, there was a woman killed in California. And in New York, about the same year, a 5-year-old died after she was made to swallow a cocktail of ammonia and vinegar and had her mouth sealed shut. She died from that. And this happened a lot in the '90s. The 17-year-old was suffocated by her mother with a plastic bag because she was trying to kill the devil who she believed to be inside her. Now, arguably, that wouldn't be a prescribed exorcism. That could be just the
Right.
mother having these delusions and then unfortunately killing her child. But then in 2001, there was a woman in New Zealand that was actually strangled by a priest during an
Mhm.
exorcism. And the list goes on about all of these different activities that have taken place. Well-meaning people in some cases not. But it is something to consider that the idea of exorcisms, they're very traumatic. They're very dangerous. They're not something to be taken lightly, and they're definitely, um, the it's not like they show in the movies, we'll just say that, it's not even in the movies, it looks very traumatic, but, I mean, again, there are very real consequences for things like this, and, people have, died, they've died of dehydration, lack of oxygen, just the mental torment of it all, and definitely mental illness has played a part in some of that, so there's been a case in South Germany. It was actually a pretty famous case. Two films were made about this girl's ordeal, the exorcism of Emily Rose in 2005, and a movie called Requiem in 2006. And this was a story from actually 1968. The girl was diagnosed with epilepsy and was on medication, but it wasn't really helping her. And so by the 70s, she ended up being admitted to the hospital for 6 months having tuberculosis, and she just became more depressed and had more issues, and the medication still wasn't working, and so a neurologist found that her EEG was starting to show abnormalities, and a week later, she claimed to see a demon in a vision, and she would start to pray, and then the prayer just became longer and more intense, and then she would become really afraid and paranoid, and in some cases delusional, but this went on for a few years until she would just suffer countless seizures and continue to see what she described as demonic faces with horns, and she said she smelled horrible sulfuric smells, and it was just an ordeal, and so, by this point, her father took her to a northern Italian town and told her, she was going to be healed. And this was where she would see Mary. It had been a place of pilgrimage for people for many years. And while she was there, she fell to the ground and said that her feet were on fire. They called the local priest for help, and they started to give her an impromptu exorcism. And at this point, she started tearing off her clothes, urinating on the floor. She was eating whatever she could find, and she like just grabbing handfuls of dirt, and she attacked the priest. And apparently, the priests say that the demon who had taken possession of her called himself Judas. And so they kept trying to help her, and it took years. And, after the mid-70s, they had these failed attempts to help her with these exorcisms and still with medication. And so the priest decided to try harder and go in for more intensive exorcisms. And so the demons, including the Judas demon, and then others that called themselves Lucifer, Hitler, Nero, they started to become increasingly violent. And this girl had just gone through the ringer, close to a decade, starting with the delusions or the epileptic seizures, and then all the way to this, just violent, slamming her head against the wall, not sleeping, not eating. And her knees actually broke after she had been kneeling so many times to pray. And so by the time she ended up dying, and it was a day after her, and this is mind blowing, but her 67th exorcism. And she had died from just losing so much weight and going through all of this. And so the cause of death was actually malnutrition and dehydration. And at the time she died, she weighed only 70 pounds. And you can imagine a grown woman, at this point weighing 70 pounds. And her parents and the two priests who were involved in this uh, were actually convicted of negligent homicide. And so as a result, there's a lot of legends about her and of course these movies that had been made. And so it can be a very dangerous thing. And so that, I mean, it's hard to unpack that because you could say, well, clearly she had epilepsy and that was the cause of her illness. She had, the doctors failed her, her parents failed her, the priest failed her. These entities, was she suffering just from these delusions, or at which point do you draw the line between either, delusions or these are actual possessions of entities? And either way, again, it's something to be taken very seriously because she tragically died. And
Right.
you would think that that would, have people maybe considering this a little more, looking into it a little more, or regulating it at the very least. But even though there are these clear dangers, the exorcisms have become more popular than ever. They're on the rise in many countries, in Italy and in the Vatican, and in the Catholic, practice that's become something that has been increasingly popular. But then also in the evangelical movement, it's been something that's very popular in the United States. And I discussed that a little bit in the book as well. My experience actually witnessing what would maybe be looked at as a non-traditional style exorcism, if you consider the traditional one to be something recognizable in pop culture, like the priest saying, "Demon, what is your name?" and this sort of thing. So, but the practice is becoming more and more popular, and with that, I guess that means there's going to be a lot more potential for dangers, and so and what's interesting too, are there are some psychologists that are starting to incorporate exorcism into their practices because they believe that there may be some benefit to it if your client or patient is somebody who has these pre-existing beliefs already. Or so that it comes down to that symbolism again. In my view, that if it works, if it's something that you can use to have them break through and have this understanding, and maybe that can reach into their subconscious and heal them in some way. And then in that case, is it their subconscious or is this their spirit? Is that what that is? Or, it might seem just like semantics again or splitting hairs, but this to me was one of the important themes in the book, is just trying to figure out what are we talking about when it comes to evil and demons. Because it's so easy to just imagine a demon as just a hooved red character with horns, and then not completely appreciate what we understand as humans to be a demonic entity.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's like, even as a psychologist, maybe someone who doesn't believe in the same religious beliefs that the person is they're talking with, doing the exorcism maybe to the patient, it's like a drug that actually helps them, whereas to the psychologist, it's a placebo, something they don't
Mhm.
necessarily believe, but still affects the mind. And that's still, I think it's really interesting just in general. I didn't know that some were doing that these days. Um,
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a couple demons just a little bit ago, and you mentioned a number of demons throughout the book. But one that I would like to discuss, and let me know if I mispronounce either of these names, but I'd like to discuss Asmodeus for a moment. Now,
Mhm.
according to your research, and this is actually just so everyone knows, this comes from the chapter called Summoning Demons that you talk about this. But according to
Mhm.
your research, he was an especially wretched demon that was perhaps enslaved by, is it Ornias?
Mhm.
Okay. Saved by Ornias through the magic ring of Solomon, which was given unto Solomon as a gift from God by the archangel Michael. Now, Solomon lent Ornias after capturing him. He lent it to Ornias to capture other demons for the construction of Solomon's temple. Now, in the book, you had mentioned that the similarities between Asmodeus and Lucifer are actually remarkably similar. My question is, would you mind sharing some of the attributes shared between these two entities, and also what ultimately separates them as two separate demons as opposed to possibly the same demon with two different names?
Oh, that is a really great question. Um, and well, so I would start by saying that they were two different demons um, in the interpretation and just the story. However, I believe that given their particular attributes, I really think that they were one and the same in a lot of ways, and that's it's one of these cases where maybe it came through and had that religious syncretism where some of these things melded into one and then became the other, et cetera. I think that this is more about it being a Promethean figure. So I don't know that they are two separate ones. Clearly, they have two separate stories, but a lot of these stories have crossover. A lot of these stories are very ancient, but then they are revived in the Renaissance, and then they're expanded or changed. Many different authors, written different versions, and there's all these threads of similarity between these types of Promethean figures. And so while Asmodeus is, well, he was considered the demon of occult wisdom and human technological advances. And he was considered also the successor to the Egyptian god of wisdom and learning, Thoth, who both of them were linked to Sirius. And so, I mean, it sounds like kind of strange, maybe to your listeners, that these demons could be connected to these Egyptian gods. But again, it might be it's one of these things that I discuss in the book of demonizing, the process of demonizing, and so it's throughout a lot of these ancient cultures, they had these gods or these entities. They sometimes they didn't even separate the demons from the angels. They would just consider them these spiritual entities. But either way, uh, they would take on these attributes and change the way they looked or what have you, their name, depending on what culture they would be in. But their key components would of their personality would stay the same. And so that's what leads me to believe that they were the same figure, because of how they're portrayed in all of these different cultures. One, for example, is that in Islamic tradition, Asmodeus was considered a jinn, and it's the very same jinn that cheated Aladdin out of the ring to secure the magic lamp. I mean, that's the very, very common and popular, um, being. So it's like Asmodeus was the king of these demons, and Lucifer was considered to be, the king of these demons in a lot of the different stories. And again, he was a Promethean figure to connect him to Prometheus, who had the similar feature of being, say, a entity of wisdom or technological advances. And in a lot of ways, I think that I don't want to dismiss them by saying, well, these are just names for the same thing, because they do contain very different and specific attributes and characteristics that link them to their particular times and cultures. However, it is my belief that they are referencing the same spirit or entity. And that spirit or entity, or even archetype, if you will, is that of the trickster, the Promethean figure, and that sort of thing. And so that would be, I think, in our society, be considered Lucifer. So I do think Asmodeus is Lucifer, and Lucifer is Asmodeus.
Okay. Well, this particular chapter is actually just really fascinating to me. And so moving on to page 122, under the subtopic of possession pandemic, you actually talk a little bit about how, according to some Muslim researchers, jinn can be responsible for a number of psychological disorders. Now, it is in fact believed that a jinn doesn't need to fully possess a person, but can cause physical and emotional trauma by infiltrating the human brain either directly or through the bloodstream in order to affect the hormones and neurotransmitters of a person. Now, this section is, again, really interesting to me, but what actually piqued my curiosity was a sentence that you wrote that said, some Muslim researchers have suggested that the presence of jinn can be detected by MRI or magnetic resonance imaging. And so my question is, was there at all in any of your research any indication on how an MRI may expose a jinn or what a jinn's presence within the human body may actually look like?
Yes, actually, this is something that I found to be uh, so important. I had to put it into the book, but also a little frustrating because um, it's not as developed as it's probably I have limitations in my language and ability to translate. So there's a lot more scientific research out there available that I unfortunately wasn't able to translate. So from my limited ability to get English versions of different research, I found that this is a legitimate study in the Islamic world to track down jinn as a physical phenomenon. And they've used different things like MRI to try to find what it is that, could be responsible if they could detect it somehow. And so, yes, they, eh, it's a little, at least in my opinion, it's a little unconvincing. So they just look at these different activity areas that are I guess, illuminated in the mind that they've sort of linked to particular types of what they believe would be a possession. Again, it's something that I'm like, well, maybe within a different context that could be helpful. So I didn't see anything that was overwhelmingly convincing, which is why I think what I found to be even more interesting was the research that had to do with looking at the molecular explanation for demons as opposed to the MRI, because it continued the idea of a germ theory of demonology that they were able to back up with mathematic models. And I thought, that is really interesting because again, instead of looking at, an MRI and these sorts of scans are, clearly scientific, but there's a little bit of subjectivity that can go into them by having to look at them or have your senses. But so I don't want to call it qualitative, but there's definitely a little bit of user bias that could enter that. So when I saw that what they were doing in addition to the MRI is using mathematic models to not only uh, identify the jinn, but to predict their behavior to within a certain level of accuracy. I thought, wait a minute, now it's getting quantitative. Now it's getting a little on the harder edge of science. And I thought, what? For one thing, I thought it was quite fascinating that there's actual finance, research going into this at a university level. And of course, some people have cited that part of the book as being, objectionable because they say, well, it's pseudoscience and et cetera. But if they're using the scientific method, and that's the way they'd like to look into that, I have no problem with that. I don't think that there's anything wrong with natural curiosity and also trying to use science to perhaps investigate issues of religion or theology. And so, from my perspective, it was very exciting research. And so, again, they have that idea of maybe germ theory of demonology that's very much similar to the ancient Mesopotamian approach to demonology. And so in this kind of explanation for demons, uh, they think of it beyond just mental illness, but also related to the mental illness, but that these jinn or evil spirits are sort of responsible for things like epilepsy, autoimmune, even cancer. And so, according to some of the scientists in Morocco that are working on this research, these spirits are invisible to the naked eye, but not like ghosts or something, but more like microbes. And they contend that the existence of these evil spiritual molecules exist beyond human perception, but that they believe they're getting close to being able to pick them up through ways like MRIs or advanced microscopes using many different methods to try to find them. But in the meantime, they felt, well, we're going to look at this molecular composition of these evil spirits and try to figure out some of the key questions. And so, interestingly, they thought about the idea of demons sort of being linked to the darkness, and in all of the fables and tales, demons don't like light. They spook around corners or in dark places, and so the idea of that is that they're averse to light, which explains why they appear at night in the dark, and they believe that they have their own then physical laws or life cycles, and that they can enter the bloodstream and rapidly multiply, and so they sort of built this whole system around this by using faith, I would say, first as a guide, and then using the scientific method to try to test that or detect that. And but I thought it was so fascinating that they were able to, you should look at the mathematic models and try to figure out, and they claim are able to predict the movement of these demons and how they'll manifest in the physical body of somebody. Now, again, it's hard. It's definitely something to look at with a healthy level of skepticism, and it's another maybe a ethical question, or to some people, should science dictate our beliefs or should our beliefs dictate science? But which comes first? But I felt it was important to add into the book just simply because I think it's important to kind of get out of our own, Western centric way of approaching science and explore what other people are doing and how they're looking at it. It might, help to expand our understanding of these things called jinn or even demons. So, but yeah, I think there's some exciting research on the horizon, and I would really, really love to see um, sort of a more interdisciplinary approach to looking at this. If anything, I think it would help expand ideas, of medicine.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And like, I over the years I've constantly said how I think just science and religion really have to have a balanced marriage between the two, because we're always getting this, religion says this, science says that, and we're always butting heads lately, it seems like. Uh but seeing something like this with the MRI and how we can detect possibly demonic entities through science while still claiming, yeah, hey, there's a possibility, but maybe not. This is the evidence for both sides. It's just really an interesting thing, and I think very important for researchers, especially those within the paranormal field and the occult, to really get on board with.
I agree. I think it's very important to start looking toward the scientific method or using scientific tools and quantitative methods to try to, separate the cream. So hopefully we'll have more of that. I don't think it's I think it's good. I don't think that it is. This is my just personal opinion, but I don't think that it is challenging, say, to use science to try to investigate the natural world and to try to do those things. I think that it can actually strengthen faith and do a great service. And I'm just one of those people. I don't believe that there should be that just disregarding it as superstition. I think that in a lot of ways, religion in that maybe spiritual sense, not necessarily organized, but just the idea of religion in a human sense, it's actually uh, the precursor to science. It was the first way we tried to, understand the world around us and the happenings, and we had philosophy and then science, and I just don't think that they belong to so separately. I think that it's important to use science to understand the things that we don't understand.
Agreed.
I think we've found our muse, Eric, for the ParaTruth Radio in Dr. Heather Lynn. So, something you bring up in the book, and I think it's like really important that we do this, but I am kind of curious about your intentions about putting the protections against evil in the book, because you had mentioned earlier about how psychologists are using exorcism as a way to treat patients. What was your original thought about putting that particular chapter in the book?
The chapter about the can you explain that one more time?
The deliver us from evil, may we no longer fear any evil, all those
Oh,
different ways that you can protect yourself from evil.
yeah. Oh, well, I felt that was so important to add into the book because a lot of the book, if I'm discussing things like serial killing or, a lot of these horrific archaeological finds and, you know, it it seems it could seem at least a little disheartening, discouraging. And I really wanted to point out that throughout a lot of my research and my interviews, that this wasn't something to fear, that we didn't have reason to actually fear. And from what I've found to be the case with the interviews, is that fear is actually more dangerous than, if you're trying to not have an evil entity around you or any kind of like negative influence, then the you definitely don't want to have fear. And so fear is something that can create vulnerability. And again, it could be the argument that, well, that fear puts you in some sort of like metaphysical state of negativity, and then that leaves the door open for something, otherworldly to enter your life. Or it could also be that perspective of if you dwell in a negative place psychologically, you'll be more prone to go down those negative dark roads. Either way, I thought it was very important to, balance and at least maybe end the book to a certain extent with that advice of not being afraid and looking at some of the ways that ancient people try to protect themselves in the past and how people are trying to protect themselves now. And is there anything that we can glean from that, or are they all just superstitions? Is it just, oh, hold on to the amulet and that'll make you feel better? Or, is there anything like that? And I really have to say, I'm really grateful to Bill Bean for his input into this. He really got me to see his experience with exorcisms. I talked to him for a very long time in many interviews, and it was fascinating to see how um, similar the experiences he had and has on a regular basis actually have been to some of the accounts of ancient exorcists, except he didn't even necessarily know that. So it was really interesting to see that there were these similarities, and the advice that he gave is something that, while it may sound very basic or very contemporary, is something that is shared throughout many cultures yet again, and many different time periods. That if you want to invite positivity into your life, something good, and deflect any sort of evil, there are a handful of things that somebody could or should do that can make them less likely to encounter those evil things. And again, that might be a little dangerous. The idea could be dangerous to put out, because it almost borders on that idea of the secret, or the law of attraction, or all of these sort of new age ideas, which can be dangerous because it also has a foot in the idea of victim blaming, where you can have so much hubris that you think that you alone can deflect the evil or attract the positive. And so when things don't go that way, then it's easy to, point a finger of blame. And so it's not something, I'm trying to do, but it's something that I thought it needed to be said so that people could at least have a hopeful view on what things they may be able to do to protect themselves, especially if they already felt that they had been in having an encounter with a demon. Because I had gotten a lot of emails from people who, wanted to discuss this with me. And I've been on shows where people have called in and discussed that they are being tormented actively by demons. And so I thought that, there are actually people out there that may benefit from some of the advice that is, again, not necessarily coming from me. I don't have the credentials to tell people how to ward off evil spirits, but it's just basically um, you know, a, a, an amalgamation of historical insight and the advice of other people, and then maybe a little common sense thrown into that. So, you know, I do have a section in there on how to protect yourself and against demons. And one thing that I found to be interesting is something as simple as cleaning your personal space and your living environment. Um, you know, the things like that, putting things that you enjoy around you, things that are uplifting and spiritual. And it may sound wishy washy, and again, a little new age or something, but um, I, I I just see that, to me it's so true, because when you look at maybe like some of my descriptions of the house and environment that the murderer from North Carolina had, he surrounded himself with occult symbols and, pictures of demons and a horrifically filthy environment. And at this point, he was already in the throes of whatever had him, and so much so that he, surrounded himself with the dead bodies of his own neighbors. So clearly, we have this extreme example of the surroundings being a reflection of what was going on inside. And so, with both people who or religious in their thinking, spiritual, and even psychologist, or just old fashioned folk advice, and all the way up to what then I would consider to be self evident or just maybe common sense. But the idea that if you maintain order around you, that you're, building a spiritual protection, and maybe not, if you're concerned about evil entities, maybe don't decorate your room with a bunch of, pentagrams and demonic images, and try to actively do what Bill Bean called living in warrior mode. And I thought that was a really good piece of advice.
Yeah, it's really cool. It makes me think of all the different, like, there's window decals and T-shirts that say "good vibes" on them, and
Yeah.
it's pretty much the same. In a way, it's the same thing. Have that positive outlook on life. Be thoughtful. and just keep those good vibes around, because negativity really does bring on negative things, whether that be physical, emotional, spiritual. So we just got to be aware of what we put around us, whether it be people or objects or anything, and just take on life head on and just be
I agree.
ready.
Garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, this does bring us to the end of the show. So, Doctor, I would like to give you a moment here to kind of tell everybody where they can find you, where they can pick up your book, and of course, share any information you'd like to share.
Well, you can find me on my website, which is drheatherlynn.com. That's drheatherlynn.com. And my books are available at all bookstores. They're on Amazon, and they're on audiobook as well. And I have a new book out right now called The Anunnaki Connection. It's about human origins and the fate of humanity as well. So, yeah. And I'm also on social media, Facebook, those types of things. But just come to my website and you'll be able to learn more about me and my books.
Awesome. All right, Dr. Heather Lynn, thank you so much for being on ParaTruth Radio.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a really, really great honor. I really love the show.
Thank you.
All right, folks, that was Heather Lynn, author of Evil Archaeology, Demons, Possessions, and Sinister Relics. She has a couple more works out, or in the works to come out, so definitely looking forward to that.
We had just gotten off the line with Demons, Possessions, and Sinister Relics. If you have not read this book, I do recommend picking it up. It was a really interesting read, very fascinating, and I had a lot of fun with this interview here today. There's a lot of information in this book that I think we've talked a little bit about over the years, but we got to dive into some really interesting stuff, especially in how science and religion or faith can very unite in the same topics, in the same things. So,
yeah. So after reading through it and talking to her, I actually really loved the fact that she kind of has done what we've talked about for a long time, brought science and religion together to talk about these things. Not once did she ever claim that she believed one way or the other into these different things, which I thought was a very academic way of looking at it. But at the same time, we've talked about it several times, how science and religion have to have a coming back together, because at one point they were together and then they split because of some rumors started by a
divorce, man. Broken.
So
that's all that happens with divorce.
That's pretty much. So what are some of the things that you took from this, or what are some of your final thoughts about the interview in the book?
Yeah. So, I mean, I still had more questions that I would have been great to have asked her, but unfortunately we are on a time limit with this show. So it's a little disappointing, but like I said, there's a lot of things that I really just found interesting. And, we talked about it a little bit. She got into it. But there was a chapter titled "The Most Horrific Archaeological Finds." And that was another fascinating chapter. And she really went into basically just different archaeological sites or archaeological finds that were really just actually about a Neolithic massacre, which was a huge, massive bone pit that showed various bones of men and women, primarily women, though, and young children, which looked like ritualistic murders or ritualistic sacrifices. But what was really interesting that she found were that some of these bones had markings as if the flesh was cut from the bone itself. Now, I guess some of her colleagues believe that it was just part of the sacrifice. She had actually thought that there's much more to it, and at this particular site, people would actually cannibalize the sacrifices afterwards.
Mhm.
Now, apparently, I think as far as I could tell, the area in which this happened only lasted, like the village, only lasted about 50 years, I think. Nobody really knows if they picked up and moved on or if it just kind of crumbled. But it was one of those things that were just really creepy and interesting. And another one that I actually kind of liked, because you know how I am with the idea of witchcraft, and it just is something interesting to me about the history of witchcraft. And there's this section called Witch Bottles and Smoked Cats. Uh, don't know if you're not the most fun read in regards to the smoked cats, but there is these witch bottles that people were finding, that archaeologists were finding all over the world, even here in America, especially in the New England area, in which there were these small bottles that contained things like urine and pins or needles, nail clippings, hair clippings, all, various different things. And it was believed that if you had one of these bottles and put it into a wall or buried it underground, it would protect you from any type of bewitchment or curses placed on you by witches. And of course, the urine, it was believed that by putting it down in the ground or wherever, you would cause the said witch to have extreme pain when urinating. Going to that level, I don't know why. Oh, well, let's make her hurt when she urinates. Or but I thought that was really interesting, and these can still be found today, especially in New England, but even throughout the country. I think there's this kind of horrible thought that somebody living in New England, maybe living in a home that has one of these witch bottles embedded in their walls, and they don't even know about it. Soaked cat thing, where again people were finding dead cats that almost looked burnt or smoked to kind of mummify them, and these cats were placed also into the walls or underground, and very often were found with rodents, either in their mouth, or they would be kind of placed in a way where it's cat chase mouse type of ordeal. And it was believed, or is believed, that this type of protection spell or talisman or a warding, whatever you want to call it, of protecting a person's home or property from rodents. So again, another one of those really interesting things. That sad thing, especially for, I've got 6 cats in the house. So to think of one of them being smoked and put into walls, is just a little scary. Yeah. What about you?
I think the biggest thing that I liked about it was the fact that not only did she, and I had mentioned this during the interview, not only did she do these different evil things throughout the book, archaeology, she talked about stuff that we talked about last episode, which was talismans, charms, those sort of things. But she also brought up the fact that there's protection as well. And, I thought it was actually really interesting when she brought up the fact that there are some psychiatrists right now using an exorcism, quote unquote exorcism, to treat patients that are believing that they're possessed. They're using that belief and using this method to cure them in a sense, or at least treat them. So I thought that was like fascinating. I've never heard that before. So I definitely recommend the book because it is very packed full of knowledge, and just the fact that she, like I said, is bringing together science and religion in a book that is about something that is still taboo to this day, even. So I thought it was a great book and a great interview. So. All right, folks, I hope you have enjoyed Evil Archaeology. Make sure you like, share, subscribe wherever you are, and check out all the great shows that we have on United Public Radio Network. Again, this has been a pre-recorded show for 107.7 FM New Orleans and United Public Radio Network. Until next week, where you'll find us same time, same channel. We'll see you next time.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.